On Monday, June the 24th, 2019, Trevor and I stopped by Pap Gram's house and sat down and interviewed them, asking them questions about their childhood and growing up and life. And after we had done that, we sent those clips on to Timothy, and he was going to stitch them together, edit them, and share them with us. However, his computer died, and with it we thought those clips were gone. I'm going to be retiring here at the end of the week, and I've been cleaning out my office and going through old files and also files on my computer, and I found those clips that we had recorded, and have been able to bring them home and tried to edit them, and I stitched them together and put them in a format that we can share and that our family can enjoy and remember and appreciate the lives of John and Naomi Croft. So I hope that this will be something that you can refer to in the future and maybe treasure. So thanks to Mom and Dad for sharing a little bit about their lives.
What was your childhood like? Where did you grow up and go to school? And what kind of kid were you?
Well, my parents were missionaries. So I lived in different places, different countries. I was born in the country of Guyana, South America. And then the next place was Grand Cayman, Jamaica, Antigua, Guyana, Jamaica. So we moved, those were all moves we made during my growing up years. And I went to school. I went to it wasn't exactly public school. The main school was a girls' school in Antigua. That's where I finished school. And so I was with my parents till I was 19, and they came home on furlough. And then I started college at Frankfurt Pilgrim College in Indiana.
What were you like growing up as a kid? Where did you grow up and go to school? And what kind of kid were you?
Well, I was born at Chester Hill, Pennsylvania. It's over by Phillipsburg. And in 1937 we moved to Woodland, is where I grew up. And went to school at Woodland. I remember the first day of going to school, down there as we opened the door and went in, it seemed like it was so big. And you look at it today and it doesn't look near as big as it did then. As far as what kind of a kid I was, one thing, I was bashful. In fact, in second grade I failed because the teacher said I was too bashful, even though my grades were not that way. And well, I went to 2 colleges. And after graduating from high school, I felt the call of God to be a preacher. And so I was encouraged to go up to Roberts Wesleyan College in New York. And when I went up there, my dad left me off and went home, and so I was left alone, and I was very bashful. And one of the things that they said you had to do was to sit alongside of a girl and pull out the chair for her and things like that, and that was more than I could handle. And so I think they had 1 meal in there out of 14 or something like that. And so on Sunday morning I decided to go home. And when I went home, I had to hitchhike. I think I got 10 rides. I wasn't sure which direction to go, but the Lord helped me to get home. And I remember getting home how that I come up the railroad track and come in the basement, and I rattled the door, and Dad said to Lois, go and see who's at the door. And she said, it's just a cat. And finally, after a while, they went to the door, and there I stood. And so, because of that, I had to go into the Army. I was in the Army for 2 years, and overseas in Germany. And so, when I got out, it was in January. And so, in the fall of 1955, I went to Frankfurt to go to school to prepare to be a preacher. And I was still bashful. And some said that he won't stay, he'll come home. And I didn't know anybody there. And I sat there and I was about ready to drive off. And this man that I was talking to, he said to me, he saw the condition I was in, he says, I'll go with you to register. And so he took me over to register. He don't know what he did in doing that. It was just, as I often used as an illustration, about a cup of cold water. And that man, when you think of it, has a big reward in a way when you think that there's 9 preachers in our family now, because most of them, because of one man that said, I'll go with you and help you.
I want to share a story from my childhood when my parents were missionaries in Grand Cayman. My mother had some physical problems and kind of needed to get away. And we had friends who, for part of the year, they would go to an island called Swan Island. And it had an American weather station on it. But it was just a few people that lived there. It wasn't even a town, really. And so they invited my mother to come to Swan Island and spend a month or 2. And so she took me and a Cayman lady that lived with us. And we were going to go to Swan Island, of course, by boat. That's all there was. And so we got on a boat, and it was a Honduran vessel. And somehow a storm came up. And it poured the rain, and the deck where we were really staying was just soaked with water. And so they got lost. Somehow their compass wasn't working, and it came to our knowledge that they were lost. They didn't know where they were. And so we ended up in Belize, Honduras, and thankfully the Lord helped us to get there when it was still light. If it had been in the dark, the nighttime, they would not have known. There were reefs all around there, and we could easily have been wrecked. But it was the home place of the boat, the Honduran boat. I could tell more about that, but we finally ended up in Swan Island. And the time that I was there, it just seemed like everything wrong was happening to me. I got a piece of rusty metal up in the bottom of my foot, and it was in there several days before they could finally get it out. And the gentleman where we stayed, he got it out with a sail needle. Then I nearly broke my shoulder with a big pole that we were using to pick mangoes. And the worst thing, I guess, was that I scalded my hand with boiling water, and I nearly lost my mind. And I cried and cried and cried. They were going to kill cows that day, and he teased me that he was going to kill a cow for me, and I wanted to be there. And I ended up having my hand scalded, and I cried the rest of the day, I guess. The next morning, my fingers were all blistered, and Mother thought maybe the devil was just trying to do away with me on that trip. But thank the Lord, I got back to Grand Cayman.
We were scheduled to go back to Grand Cayman in 1971, and it was in the middle of the year, so it was January, and so we were packed and made a trip down to Grand Cayman, and then there was some things that had happened that were different, what they were doing when we were there the first time. And so what they were doing, they were covering the cabinets with formica, and so we thought that was a nice thing to do, and so I covered all of our cupboards in our kitchen. And so Sister Bowman saw them, and she liked them, and she wondered if I would be willing to put the formica on her cabinets. And I told her that I would. And so in order to put it on, you had to put it on with this glue. I had read that it was flammable, but I didn't read the word extremely. And so that night, or that day I was working, I believe Dorcas was with me when we worked in the morning and afternoon, and then that night I was going to take Bob up there, but it just happened to be that he had a thing of some young people coming that night, or he'd have probably been there with me. And so I went up by myself, and I was putting it on. It was there was a stove right alongside of the cabinet, and I was going to take the stove out, and then I thought, no, I can get this in without taking that stove out. I didn't realize that the pilot light was on. It was a gas stove, and so I had a whole gallon bucket of this cement, which is glue that really is very explosive if you get fumes into where there's a fire. And all at once, the thing ignited, and I wasn't trying to be brave or anything like that, but I just reached down and grabbed that can with my hand and started out of the house. And as I was going out of the house, all that glue was bubbling out of the can, and it's on fire and went all down over me and up my arm and my hand and
Your legs.
And my legs. And then when I got to go out the door, I think I slipped and fell, and the can went out ahead of me. And I come out of the house, and Sister Bowman said the right words. She says, "Oh, John, lay down and roll." All I could think of, I got to get this out because of my wife and family. And I was ready to run. But those words saved my life. I stayed there for a while to try to help put out the fire, but it got to hurting more. And so I got in the car and thought I would start driving to get some help. And a miracle happened that night. The Lord knew what I needed. And Brother Jefferson, he had a little store there down from where we lived, and he would take and go up to his granddaughter's place and give her chewing gum. And he says he always drove, but he said something said tonight says to walk. And he said, I never walked, but something said walk. And so I come driving by and I see Jeffy, and I told Jeffy what happened and asked him if he'd take me to the hospital. And when he got in and drove the car and took me to the hospital, and we walked into the hospital, and it began to really hurt bad, and I don't remember too much what happened after that until maybe the next day, and finally Naomi and them came.
I didn't, of course, know anything about it till Sister Bowman called me and told me that John had been burnt and had gone to the hospital, and she was going to send Brother Martin over to get me and take me to the hospital. When I got there, he was totally beside himself in pain. He had a bubble this big hanging down from his hand. And they had given him injections and nothing worked. Nothing helped. He was just, you could hear him on the outside because that hospital was very open, just screens and very open. And so finally they decided they were going to have to take him to the operating room and put him out, which they did. And they cleaned him up a little bit, but not a whole lot. He had burns on his legs, his ankles, his side, his arm and hand, and it was pretty extensive. And they really didn't do a whole lot for him as far as he was just there laying, and the doctor had assured me that they could take care of him. They were able. And I trusted the doctor. And so it finally ended up that I'd called his parents. He wanted me to let them know and hopefully that they would come. And it did work out that they did come. His dad and mother and Lois and Becky came. And that was about the 7th day. And that day, the doctor decided to operate on his ankles. And they took him in the operating room and operated. And just about the time that he was coming out from surgery, his parents got there to the hospital. And the doctor came and spoke to me, and I introduced him to his dad. And he said, I need to talk to both of you. And so he told us, he said, you need to get him off of the island as soon as you can. And I had no idea how to do it, where to go. And to make a long story short, some of the business people of the island came to my help and said that they would arrange for a doctor and the hospital to go to. And he was taken by commercial jet to Miami, and a nurse, K-Man nurse, went with him. And the next day, I had to get ready to go with the children, and well, John's dad went with him to Miami, and the nurse. And then it was his mom and 2 sisters, and the children and I the next day. But I did want to say that everywhere I went and walked, somebody would meet me and give me money to help. with the expenses. And the church gave me quite a large sum of money to help with the expenses. I had no idea what we were going to need. And anyway, I didn't get to Miami then till the day after John went.
As my dad and I were on the plane together and traveled over to Miami, I didn't know much what was going on. I can't remember much. I think I woke up a time or two, but we landed at the airport in Miami. They thought they had everything scheduled for the place for her to go to the hospital and a doctor. But just to show you how God is always one step ahead of you, sometimes we don't understand how God works. But God was always a step ahead of us as I think of this whole story. And so we landed, and whenever we landed there, they told us that the hospital was so full that they couldn't even take an emergency case. And the doctor I was supposed to have was on vacation. And it's awful easy to think, well, where was God? Did he let you down? But no, he was just one step ahead. And they finally took me to a private hospital, and the doctor that I had, he had been in the service and he had been burned himself, and he didn't, he did everything that he could to help me. And it was just quite an experience. And the next day, Naomi and the rest of the family come. We did not know that what we were going to need. And the thing was that we had to have nurses around the clock, 24 hours a day, and had to be paid every 3 days. And how God, with what Naomi said that the people had given to her, was all that we needed, and to be able to pay for the nurses and to get the family home. And so God was looking out even before we knew what we needed. And I'll never forget that how when Naomi come and told me what the church had done and what the people had done, I was just praising the Lord for what he was doing and how he was supplying our need. And they told me that burn patients are very hard to take care of, and they do a lot of cursing and swearing and biting and all kinds of things. And here I was just praising the Lord for what God had just done in supplying our need. And it was quite the story in the hospital. Even down the cafeteria it was talked about, and how God had known what we were needing before they ever got there, and supplied our need. And I remember how another time when before that she come, I was trying to ask them to get a hold of the Wesleyan pastor in Miami, and they couldn't understand me. They just thought I was saying Western Church and all that, and so they weren't able to get a hold of that pastor. But he lived clear across the city. And finally they sent a Methodist pastor in, and I told him what was happening, that my family was coming and my wife was going to need a place to stay, and I didn't know what to do. And he told me about a woman that he had in his church, and how she lived alone and her husband was dead, and he would see if she couldn't help us out. And just to show you how God works is, if I would have got the Wesleyan pastor, she would have had to go clear across the city to stay and then to get back and forwards. But here, this lady lived 2 blocks away from the hospital. And she took Naomi in and never charged her a penny. You know, but you go for when you come.
When I got there the following day, they had been working on John most of the night, I think, and cleaning him up in that room. And it looked like somebody had been butchering a cow or something in there, blood and water on the floor, and they worked on him in one bed and then they put him over in another bed. Of course it was a private room. And they had finally got him all bandaged up. But see, in Grand Command, they hadn't cleaned out any of those burns. None of it. The skin that was burnt was still there and everything. But they cleaned all of that out. And the doctor, in the days that we were there, which I think it was 11 days, he sent for a circular bed where they could put John on that bed and turn it, put him like in a sandwich, and then the whole thing would make a circle and turn. Then he could lay on his stomach for a while. But they didn't have to touch him to do any of that. And it helped him to his circulation and all to be able, and it was, they brought it there special for him. It was the Lord. That doctor was wonderful. He would have done anything for us. And finally, when he felt it was time for him to go to Pennsylvania because we didn't want to stay there for grafting. And he would have grafted him, but I would have had to stay there with him. And so we decided, no, we'll go to Pennsylvania for that. And so the doctor, he offered to go with us. But we had a nurse that had agreed to fly with us, and I didn't feel it was necessary for the doctor. And we had a good trip. They stretched John out over 3 seats. They took the armrests out. He had never sat up until that day. And he made the trip okay. But when we got to Pittsburgh, here they weren't expecting us. They didn't know that there was gonna be this patient on board. And the airline people were a little bit upset with us because we needed help for him to get off of the plane. So they came with a pole stretcher. And when I saw it, I said, that's not going to work because it would just squeeze him. And so finally they came with a wheelchair that you carry for 2 people, one in the front and one in the back. And they got him off of them. But they told me then, they said, well, he's going to have to sit up here in the waiting room till the ambulance comes, because the ambulance that we had ordered wasn't there. And it was going to take maybe 3 hours. They were just leaving Clearfield. And so I was afraid that he wouldn't have any medicine, no morphine, because he was on morphine. And I thought, wonder if we can stop by a hospital and get them to give him morphine enough for him to get to the Clearfield Hospital, which was 3 hours away, and we were waiting for several hours. And lo and behold, to back up a little bit, he did not have to sit up in the waiting room till that ambulance got there, because the Red Cross had a room there, a place where there was, I think, 3 or 4 beds and nurses to take care of you. And so he had a place to lay and taken care of. And why they told me that, I don't know. They were upset, I think, because he was there. Anyway, in Pittsburgh, the driver of the ambulance took us by a hospital and he went in and asked them if a doctor could come out to the ambulance and give him a shot of morphine. And we had his records, we had what the doctors had been giving him. And I just prayed that the Lord would help a doctor to be willing to do that. And sure enough, a doctor came out, and without him having to get out or anything, he gave him a shot. And we went on our way, and he made it good till we got to Clearfield.
When we got to the hospital, it was dark, and I remember they took me in and put me in a room. It was a different floor than what I was on most of the time until the next morning. And I remember the nurse that I had, that was a very good nurse, when she saw who I was, she had remembered I had worked with Dad up at the fruit stand and selling fruit, and she said, "Oh, he's my peach man that they bought peaches off of." And she just seemed to be a very good nurse, and she wasn't easy on you, but when you were done, you knew that it was done right. But when I got there, I asked when they were going to graft me. They were supposed to graft me, and the doctor, whenever I asked him, he said that machine's broke and he can't do it now. And he promised to graft, but all the time I was there, he never did graft me at all. And sometimes we think like that's a disappointment, but yet, even though it took a long time before everything healed, that my skin is much smoother and you don't have all that. And in some ways it was a blessing I didn't get grafted. But I remember sometimes it was very hard to be there all summer long. I was in the hospital there for 9 weeks at that time, but the whole time it was for about 12 weeks that I was in the hospital. But there was one time that we got very down.
You had a cough.
And I had a cough and nothing was happening, and I remember telling Naomi, I just wished that I died. I was brought up in the Free Methodist Church, and a pastor that was there now, at that time, he had been my pastor when I was a boy. And he come and he saw what condition I was in, and how depressed I was. He went down, it was on Sunday, he went down to church that night, and he said, "We're going to pray just for Johnny," he called me, and nothing else. And you know, they prayed that night. Brother and Sister Henry, they were black people that I knew all my life nearly with them. They came to church there, and they sang, and they came up and sang to me and told me what they had done. And you know, when Naomi came the next morning, I was just a different person. God had touched me. And the cough was gone, and it was just such a different thing. And how God supplied our needs. It was, I didn't know what it was going to cost or anything like that, but people did send money. And day after day, sometimes $200-300 would come in a day. One girl that I went to school with, she went out in Woodland area and went house to house and raised $800. And over in Port Matilda, it was the neighbor that lived alongside of us that they went out in Port Matilda. I think they raised over $300. But whenever I get out of the hospital, I was able to pay all the hospital bill and still add over $1,700 in the bank. How God supplied her need. And I was able to pay the doctor. He only charged $150 for that time, but But there were times there and whenever they started giving me therapy, how they would take me downstairs and then they had a tub that they put you in that just you sit in. And it felt good whenever you were in the tub. And then they had a gurney, like they just put you on that gurney and back they would go to the room. And I'm telling you, that was like torture. You just cried the whole way back. It hurt so bad.
When the air would.
When the air hit it. But how God worked, even as we got out of the hospital, good time to be able to, the kids had to go to school, we couldn't get a place, and how God provided a place for us that the kids could go back to the very school that they left before we went they're there in 71. And I needed a hospital bed, and how when Elma asked the man that rented us the trailer about some things, and she was saying about having to get a hospital bed. And you know, God was one step ahead of us again. And the man said, you know, the other day I just traded in a trailer and it had a hospital bed in it. I don't think these things were accidents. I think they were God working. One thing I really appreciated about when I was in the hospital, Naomi meant so much to me. She'd come at 8 o'clock in the morning and stayed to 8 at night. But it was like medicine, just to wake up and see she was there. I'll never forget it. Yeah, but you can tell anything that you want there.
Okay.
I would like to think of God as my provider. I think of Abraham, as he said concerning the sacrifice God will provide. I think early in our marriage we were living on the GI Bill. We got $120 a month, and that had to pay for our rent, and it paid for our groceries, it paid for our schooling and car payment. And I remember one time we got down to the place where we needed a loaf of bread, and we only had 17 cents and we needed 35 cents. Our check hadn't come yet, and we hadn't shared that with anybody, but God knew what we needed. And I've often think of this as something of God giving us a sign of He will provide when we go out into the ministry. And that very day, with no one knowing and none of us telling anybody, their knock came on the door, and this person handed us in a bag, and in that bag was a loaf of bread. I always thought of that as not an accident, but it was God knowing what our needs was and giving us assurance when we go out into ministry that He would take care of us. And after graduating from Frankfurt, we were asked to go to a little church in Port Matilla, Pennsylvania. I had said before I'd never want to go to that church, and yet that was one that God laid it on our heart to go.
What year?
It was in 1959 that this took place. In that church they had 7 members. We also had a little church over in State College, but the one in Port Matilla is the one that I was wanting to talk about. And so we went there, and they voted for us to come as their pastor, and all that they offered us was the paper money. And you can imagine how much that would be with 7 people. We were there for 2 months, and 4 of them left. And so we had 3 old ladies is all we had left.
3 widows.
And that wasn't much. There was times that nearly about all that we got that Sunday was $3. And yet Bob was about 2 years old, and Eunice was born at that time. And how God really supplied our needs, it was really something. I do believe when we think of that loaf of bread, it was a guarantee that He would take care of us, and we had to live by faith. And I remember how God supplied our needs over and over again. We never missed a meal, and we were able to pay any bill that we had, and it was something to see. I remember 4 of us, we bought a bus, and that bus, we had to pay $10 a piece a month for it. And I was up at a camp meeting there at Port Matilda, and they were taking up faith promise at that time, $1 a month for a year, $12. That doesn't seem like very much then, but whenever you didn't hardly have anything, it was a lot of money. I had $13 to my, or $14 I think to my name was all I had, and the Lord asked me to give 12 of that, and He said, I'll give it back. And how nobody knew that what I gave, nobody knew what I had left. I didn't raise my hand for it or nothing. And I put the $12 in, I had $2 left. I went out to get in the car, and this man come running up to me, and he shook hands with me. He said, the Lord just now told me to give you this, and He handed me $20. And that was, I had more money after giving than what I had when I gave. And it was just one time after another how God supplied our needs. When Eunice was born, we needed about $60 or $50, $60 to finish paying off the hospital bill. And they had a prayer group there in the valley, and I remember they came, they would come to our church sometime and preach or have service, and it was over State College where they had it this Sunday, and they asked me to speak. And when I was done, one of them said, I believe we ought to give Brother Croft an offering. And they said, we have $75 in the treasure. But what should we give them? One person said, why don't we give them 25? Another said, why don't we give all to them? And finally they decided to give me $50, and that paid her hospital bill. Another time, whenever we didn't know what to do, was her grandparents and her aunt was coming for the weekend. And we didn't have any money to buy groceries to be able to get some food for them while they were there. And so they were coming on Friday, and Brother Cole, who had been saved, he had been an alcoholic, he had got saved in the revival, that he felt the Lord wanted him to start tithing. And so he come down there on Thursday, and he said, I was going to put this money in on Sunday, but I thought I ought to come down and give it to you now. And so being that we got the paper money, that whatever anybody gave us, it was our salary. And so he gave us, I think, $26 or $27, his first tithe. And we were able to buy groceries to be able to feed our grandparents and that. But it was just one thing after another how God provided for us. I remember when we started a revival there. The pastor down at Julianne, at Bush Hall it was called then, we talked about these protracted meetings that they used to have where they would have a revival and they would start, and in that revival they would go until they felt the Lord would say that's time to quit. And so we decided, well, maybe we ought to try that. And I remember that he would come up and preach through the week, and I would preach on Sunday. And we went 4 months and 10 days. It was, I think, 14 weeks before we saw the first convert. And we saw an alcoholic get saved who was wonderfully changed and transformed. And then the neighbor of his who was considered a person, anything that happened, the policeman told me that it happened in Port Matilda, always look him up, see whether he done it. And how God changed these fellows' lives, and how they made restitution, and it really had an impact. And God really helped us in those 2 years, and we saw the church grow, saw people get saved, and they had a award that they gave out in the church. It was a pilgrim ship, like a picture of it, and we won that in the denomination. And how God supplied our needs, and it was when there was nothing, and how God took care of everything that we needed, and we praise the Lord for it.
My mother was a teacher, and in my very early years, she got me started in school, but then they finally sent me to school. But Mother taught us the Bible, and she was very big on memorization. And she made a plan for us as children that we had to learn a verse for every book in the Bible. She picked out a prominent key verse, and then there was just multitudes of verses throughout the Bible that were important verses, and then there were chapters, mostly Psalms, that we learned quite a few chapters. And I have always been so thankful that my mother had us memorize scripture, because that is what has stuck with me all through my life, is those that I learned as a child. And I don't know that I have one favorite Bible verse. There are just so many that have been a blessing and a help down through the years. And maybe right now I can't pinpoint one, but I just am thankful for all the scripture that Mother had us memorize. And again, with hymns, there are so many hymns that I like, and that are it's just really hard to pick one above others. One thing that has been a blessing to me through all our lives is how Jesus has led us all the way. It has been God's hand leading us each step by step by step. And one song that I like, it isn't so well known, but it's called Jesus Led Me All the Way. And then there are other songs that go along with that about Jesus leading us. And I have appreciated those songs. And then I've always liked the song of Great Is Thy Faithfulness, because God has been so faithful all through the years. Played times when we didn't know what to do or how to handle situations. And he has been faithful to take care of us and to lead us, to provide for us, to see us through everything. And I just thank him for the hymns and for the Word of God that has been my guide.
One verse that has meant a lot to both Naomi and I, that we've tried to build our life on, is there in the Sermon on the Mount where he says, "Seek ye first the kingdom of God and his righteousness, and all these things shall be added unto you." Early in our marriage, this was a verse that we chose to live by and put God first in everything, in the choices, the places where we would pastor, and all. It wasn't based on how we liked the parsonage or anything like that, but it was based on, is this what God wants us to do? And we put him first. And I think of how, as we got married and we have tried to do this, and another thing it is that we really felt how important it was that our children grow up to know the Lord. And by putting God first, and I do believe it's had an effect on our children and grandchildren, even knowing the Lord. I think of a song, one song that I, of late, that I really like, I sing it sometimes down in the basement, is "What a Friend We Have in Jesus." And when we think of all of it and even think of the story behind it, it really makes you even like it a lot more. And it's so good to be able to know that at this age, that God has been the one that has led us all the way.
If there was one bit of advice that you could leave with your kids and grandchildren, what would it be?
Well, as I've many times, whenever I was saying goodbye to the grandchildren and that one thing it's always that I felt was so important is I always told them, always put Jesus first in your life. And I do believe that's about as good advice that you can give. And I do know that I've had grandchildren repeat that to me over and over again, that what it meant to them, always put Jesus first in your life. And I don't think you can go wrong if you do that.
What advice would you give to your 20-year-old self?
This is going to sound maybe a little strange, but I have found as the older I have gotten, I am so sorry that I did not think to ask my parents and grandparents more questions. Why didn't I ask them this, or why didn't I find out about that in their way of life, or what happened to them in certain instances? And why I just never thought to ask about it. And now that's lost. It's gone forever. I'll never know. So maybe it might be a good idea young people begin to ask more questions, because we'll soon be gone. And later on you'll think of things that, I wish I'd asked that, So, yeah, we need to be more inquisitive about our heritage.
What specific stories or memories sticks out to you about your parents or grandparents?
I just thank the Lord for my parents. My dad was a very hard working man. I think it stands out a lot to me. He also was a very honest man. He took us to church. He had family worship with us. And he was one that really, I believe, loved his family. And I have a lot to be grateful for what influence he's had on us. I never ever heard my dad swear or even use a slang word, and because of his influence, I never heard one of my brothers or sisters swear in my lifetime, and I've asked them if they've ever heard, and they didn't remember of ever hearing, so that's quite an influence. And I thank the Lord that he had a truck that he used. He was self-employed most of the time that I knew him, and he sold fruit, and in the wintertime he had little coal mines, and we worked in the coal mines, and
Are you looking up?
And he was very good. I think one thing I have so much to be thankful for, when I got saved, I went to church with him that night, and they give an invitation, and I wanted to go, but I was just so fearful to go. And finally Dad said, "I'll go with you." And that is how I got started at being a Christian. I thank the Lord for my mother, and my mother didn't profess. I don't know whether she had claimed when she was young that she was Christian. She went to church and that, but with having 7 children, it was pretty hard for her to be able to go to church because all we had was a truck. And yet Mother was a good mother. I know that how important it was whenever we come home from school to be able to look until we found her. Then we were able to go outside and play. She always had our interest, and she loved us. And I really appreciate my parents. I thank the Lord that I was able to help my mother find the Lord. And I was able to be there whenever she passed away. Also, I don't have a lot of memories of my grandmothers. Both of them died at the age of 60. And I think my grandmother on my mother's side, I was about 8 years old when she died, and 11 or 12 whenever my other grandmother died. I do remember my grandmother Croft. She had a stroke, and she stayed with us the time of my sister was born. And I can remember that she would hold Lois and kind of rock her, but she lived with us for a while, and that was one memory I had of her. My other grandmother, I just have very few memories I had of her. My grandfathers, they didn't profess to be saved, and my one grandfather died at 74. My other grandfather, he was around 90. And I just thank the Lord for my parents. When I think of my grandfather, I think he sometimes drank and things. And my dad, I don't know, he didn't have a lot of good memories of his dad. And he determined that isn't the way he was going to raise us. And I am a lot today because of my dad.
What is a specific story or memory that sticks out to you about your parents and or grandparents?
My mother's parents were godly people, and my grandfather especially, I think, left a impact and imprint on our lives. And I know even when Pap and I would stop there later on when we were married, he grew to love my grandfather. He liked to talk about spiritual things, and he was a good man, and he showed his love in different ways. And I always really liked being around my grandfather. He lived to be quite old. I forget, I think he was close to 90. I'm not exactly sure of his exact age when he died, but he took a stroke when he was still at home, and they had him at home for a long time. And so one year when we went home on furlough, we stopped by there to see them, and we had the 4 children with us. And I'll never forget what he did. He asked that each one of the children come up to his bed, and he would lay one at a time and lay his hands on their head and pray for them. And I know it made a big impression on me, and I'm sure on Bob and Eunice. I don't know that Johnny and Dorcas remembered it because they were so much younger, but it was just like, nearly like Jacob laying his hands on his grandchildren. And my other grandparents were good people too, and godly people. But we were never around them near as much. We visited a few times when we were home on furlough, but I didn't get to know them near as well personally. And so, but I thank the Lord that they were all Christians. My grandmother Philippi encouraged quite a few of her children to go to God's Bible school. And my father and his brother, who were, I think, only 16 months apart, they went together, and they were the preacher boys. And they were also the school barbers. They would cut the hair for the students, and they cut each other's hair. So when my parents got married, my father told Mother one of her requirements was that she learn how to cut hair. And she did. And she cut his hair all their years as missionaries, and of course he cut the boys, my brother's hair. So so when we got married, Pap decided I ought to learn how to cut his hair. So I've cut his hair all these years, and I'm still doing it, sometimes by the hardest, but and I cut the boys' hair as long as they were at home. And so that kind of was a hand down from my parents. Those are some of my memories.
How did you all meet and fall in love?
Well, we met when we were in Bible college at Frankfurt. I was there ahead of John, although he was older than me. And he came when I was in my my third year, I think. And I don't know exactly when we first met. I remember seeing him and thinking he was an awfully serious fellow. He wouldn't smile. He was just so serious. And I guess that's why I thought it was kind of funny when I heard he liked me. I thought, I don't know how I could handle that. Here he's not as serious as I am, maybe.
Well, I went to Bible school. I just got out of the Army in January, and I helped my dad with the fruit, to sell fruit in the summer, and then that time of, I think it was Labor Day, that I drove out to Frankfurt, Indiana. I didn't know anybody out there, and that didn't help me any. Not knowing anybody. I'd heard about Sister Bowman, but I didn't know her. And so when I got there, and after I got registered, I think I might have seen her in the administration building. I don't know whether that was the first time or not. But I think one of the things were, we had an early morning prayer meeting, and the president and his son, and there was a group of us praying for revival. And I remember that Naomi was one that was there, and I was there, and I think that was where some of it started. And then I remember it being bashful and never really having a girlfriend, and I wanted a Christian girlfriend. If I had one, I really feel God is the one that brought us together. But I remember that one day we were coming, it was early morning, we was praying for the revival, and she was falling behind me, and I had a hard time being able to say anything to her, and so I just said real quickly, I don't want you to think I don't want to talk, but I just can't. And so she said, well, I understand, John. And so there was probably some of the beginning of it, I would say. But I really feel that God was the one that brought us together, and He was the one that knew we knew each other and needed each other. And I do thank the Lord that our love for each other has always been that we loved each other and we lived for each other, and we have done things together, ministry and everything. And I do know that when you put God first and allow Him to lead you, you're not going to be disappointed. And I just praise the Lord for how He has done in that measure. And God is still working in our lives, and we still love one another, and we still
we'll soon celebrate 63
years today, or not today, but in August.
One of the things I think that had a little bit to do with our getting together, and I don't exactly know how it came about, but the boys in the dormitory found out that John liked me, and that he was so shy and hard for him to talk to people, that they got a card for him to give to me. And the card said on it, "You're just that kind of friend." And it was really not an appropriate card, because it was for somebody that had been your friend for a long time. But it kind of helped to break the ice, because I felt that I needed to thank him for the card. And I think we talked a little bit maybe, and that helped to get things going.
What have been the greatest moments of your life, and what has brought you the greatest fulfillment?
Well, I would say one thing was tragedy struck in 1971. We went back to Grand Command for the second term, and it was in January, and we were there for about 6 months when I was putting Formica on a cabinet for Sister Bowman. She wanted me to cover her cabinets with my mica. That was something they were doing down there at that time. I had already done it at the parsonage, and so I told her that I would do it. And little did I know what a day would bring forth. Remember that day I went up there and was working, and I was going to go back that night and take Bob back along, and when I found out that he had some friends coming over to play some games that night, that I went myself. I would say one of the greatest moments of our life, whenever I get burnt, and all the lessons that we learn from it, and seeing God work so many times, it just amazes us to think of how God was always one step ahead of us, helping us out. And I know that not only myself, but Naomi and the children, it had a big impact upon them. And even though it was very difficult to go through, I wouldn't want to go through it again, but I wouldn't want to take it out of my life. It taught us many lessons. I would say one of the greatest enjoyments too is to know that our children are following the Lord, and many of our grandchildren. I cannot think of anything greater than that, and to see them involved in ministry. We never ever talked to them about being preachers or anything like that, but we always talked to them about being Christians, whatever it was. If they were a carpenter or if they were a plumber or whatever they were, that they'd be Christians. And to see them serving the Lord and all the years that they've put in ministry of our children and grandchildren, and it is something that has given us great satisfaction, and we feel if there's anything greater than that, I don't know what it would be, to see your family loving God.